So, Yuji, thank you so much for coming on the Leadermorphosis podcast.
Thank you too. It's my pleasure to be on your show.
So, I thought we could start maybe by if you could give us a bit of a picture of the landscape of the new ways of working movement in Japan from your experience. What does it
Mhm,
look like at the moment?
mhm. Okay, then maybe I can start from sharing the past like 3 years, what has been happening in Japan, because there were two big milestones in these 3 years. One was the first one was the when the book Reinventing Organizations Japanese edition came out in Japan. That was in January in 2018, so it's almost 3 years. And the second milestone was when Fred Laloux himself came to visit Japan and had an event and a retreat program. That was the two major milestones we've had in these 3 years. And before going into detail, that I need to mention that there was a lot of like movements or like theories or whatever beforehand
Hmm.
the book came out. There's a lot of good practices and like how do you say gurus or masters in Japan who has been doing a lot of work. But having the book Reinventing Organizations and the concept and the word teal organization gave kind of like a direction and kind of foundation to have a good discussion and sharing the knowledge in the Japanese community. So these two events, having the book and having Fred Laloux visiting Japan, was a very good event. And the first one, when the book came out in 2018, it was so surprising that um, first of all, hardly no one knew about the word tea organization beforehand. And you have this thick book of teal organization. And the title of the book is also teal organization itself in Japanese. So you have a thick book, you have the word no one knows, teal organization. But once that book was published, it made such a sensation that so many people shared that on social media and have a lot of like study groups or communities or so on. So that was pretty much a beginning of a new way of organizations in the when the book came out. And after that, that's gonna be so 3 years. And after having that book and having a lot of discussions and like practices in the world, the second milestone was that the time Fred Laloux himself came to Japan, and that was very meaningful in several ways. And one was that the community in Japan was able to feel or like see or hear from Fred Laloux himself and have this share the same experience that that we could like hear or learn from Fred Laloux himself, and that having the common experience in the community was a very good milestone for the community. And also having like different communities trying to practice in Japan, um, trying to achieve the same goal, but there's different communities. But having the big event in Japan, that was a very good time to connect the communities between inside Japan too. So that was also a very good event for what we had in Japan. And also the when when Frederic Laloux came to Japan, he had a 2 days retreat program, and there was like 20 or less members. I was there too, and that was also a very meaningful experience too. For one, is that maybe you are aware that Fred, Frederic Laloux himself, his purpose is more shifted to like issues on climate change and not like in organizations or leaderships. So he mentioned at the beginning that that might be his last opportunity to give kind of a workshop in organizations or management, not only in Japan, but maybe in his career. So he was very passionate to share as much as possible in limited time. So that was a very pleasant experience to have that 2 days with his passion, his um, will to share everything. And also the another meaningful moment after the retreat was that I wasn't there, but the planning or the management team had a reflection with Fred Laloux. And he mentioned at the end of the reflection that the source of the teal movement in Japan won't be himself, but would be passed by to a person, Kensho Kamara. He is the person who wrote the postscript in the book. So he passed the source of Japan to a different person. And that was a very meaningful time. And Kenshu was already famous for the leader of the thought leader about the teal movement. He wrote the postscript, and he was the one who initiated the book to come into Japan. But after having that ritual, it seems that he himself has a, a deeper awareness that he is the source of this movement. And I could see that he really senses the tension or sometimes the pain that the movement has. So it's more like he's having really the source role in Japan. So that was a very meaningful time. So that's 1 year ago. So those were the two big events we had for these 3 years.
Yeah, wow. Thank you for sharing. There's lots of things I'd like to unpack in what you just shared. I guess one is it's really interesting that you pick up on this idea of source. You know, you and I have a mutual friend, Tom Nixon, who introduced me to source some years ago. And it's been interesting to see Frederic weave in the idea of source from Peter Koenig's work into the illustrated version of Reinventing Organizations. And here's an example in practice of him very intentionally handing over the source of the teal movement in Japan to Yenshu, is that his name? Kenshu, sorry. Kenshu. So that's really interesting. And I'm curious to know, like, how has that, so that was a year ago. How does that role, how does he embody that role now? And what influence does that have on the community and the movement?
Maybe for the community, not very many people might know that ritual took place. So it's not a very obvious thing. It's not hide or something, but he won't speak out for just explain around that about that. So, but what I see from Kenshu himself is that he really is having the kind of a pain or maybe a frustration recently, is that I think this might happen in not only in Japan but other places, but the concept of teal organization is so inspiring and fascinating, is that people understand that in a very not a deep way, in the only like the practitioner or the how to and so on. So, and as the more the word teal organization becomes popular, there starts to emerge misunderstandings or misleading, or like not the proper way of like consulting service or something. So that's not what he wants to see as a teal movement. And I can feel that he feels pains or frustration as the source. So I think it's pretty much a difference that really, from my point of view, emerged in himself after the passed by the source.
That's interesting. It's almost like a more it's almost like more personal to him, like it's more embodied how teal organization is used or misused as a concept. It's interesting also what you say about, because of course there have been, as you say, many movements and different gurus and masters in Japan, and also I guess you could say in the East generally. It's not that Frederick's book was sort of published into a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious, like from previous sort of movements or principles or practices that have emerged, particularly in
Mm-hmm.
Japan,
Mm-hmm.
what were some of the foundations or themes that meant that when Reinventing Organizations came out, it resonated with people?
Well, you mean that what um what was the, how do you say, I just want to have a better understanding about the question about what should I answer, or
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking about like if I use another example, like in Latin America, many people are familiar with Ricardo Semler and
mm-hmm.
Semco back in
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm.
80s. So for them, reinventing organizations was also not new, and there've been
Mm-hmm.
different movements like that around the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's kind of common themes there of, pushing down authority to the
Mm-hmm.
people who, do the work, who are on the front
Mm-hmm.
line,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And I'm interested in what some of these pre-existing principles or new ways of
Okay, okay.
working were.
I might answer from a different perspective about to your question. Is
Please.
that, well, I was like thinking what could I share in this podcast to inspire the people who are listening and maybe not very familiar with the Japanese practices that's there. And if I like roughly group like three kind of groups of practitioners going on in Japan right now, the first group might be the very new emerging small teams that is very inspired by the new ways of work, including, of course, teal organization and so on. So basically, they're small teams, small companies, established very new, mainly like startups and so on. So there's so many of examples here. And that's the first group. The second group might be the companies that have seems to be seen as the leading companies of the teal movement in Japan. There's not very many, but basically they're like established 15 or 20 years ago, mainly in the IT industry, mainly based in Tokyo, having like 100 to several hundred members. And they're pretty much seen as the leading companies of the teal movement. And they seem to have the common path, that common history, that they uh, mainly they used to have kind of like a hierarchical orange paradigm, and then came through to like um, have to change to a new way of organization, and that happened to resonate with the teal movement. So that's they didn't intend to become a teal organization, but it happens that it's very resonated and related. And those companies are really working on to also contribute to the movement itself. So not only participating, but to expand or like um, accelerate the movement itself. That's kind of a second group. There's like not very many, like 10 or 15 or those kind of groups. And the third group, I think, was some kind of an answer to your question, is that looking inside Japan, there are so many companies that run in their original ways, mainly not based in Tokyo, maybe like in like manufacturing or food companies or car dealers or whatever, that has been trying to adapt to their local community and their industry, and to treat their and employees and to contribute to the local community and so on. And they, as Frederic Laloux wrote in the book, they didn't know each other. They just tried by themselves to figure out a better way to run their organization and treat their environment, the employees in the environment, and grow their business. So there's so many of them in Japan. So people who has been working on these new ways of working are used to look very much at those third groups that traditionally has a lot of efforts and they're unique unique ways of running the organizations. So I think that's pretty much the wide view I can see in the Japanese community right now.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I guess that maybe brings us on to a topic that I'm really interested to dig into, which is to look at some of the sort of cultural differences
Mm-hmm.
that you see between Japan and maybe some of the more like Western philosophies or paradigms of ways of
Mm-hmm.
working or ways of being together, and how that the implications that that has on new ways of working, especially as organizations become more global. Because I think it's really
Mm-hmm.
interesting. We can't assume that our office in the US, introducing teal there is going to be the same as introducing teal in Japan, for example. So I'm really curious to see what are your thoughts about that? How would you distinguish the cultural differences?
Yeah, that's really the most exciting topic I would like to speak on this with you today. And maybe I can start from my personal journey about how I came to this topic, because that's really related to what I see right now. And it's been like 4 or 5 years ago I really came into this topic. And before that, I used to be one of the founding members of an IT startup. I was a board member and COO at a tech startup. So, and funded from a Silicon Valley venture capital. So was really in the orange capitalism paradigm. And I loved that work. It was very exciting. But at at some moment when the company grew to like 30 people, I started to think that to grow the company, the organizations should be in a hierarchical structure and also have some kind of a command and control kind of management to grow the business. And I myself shifted the company into that kind of paradigm. And I do think that was the best answer I had, and I still think that was correct to grow the company. And the company is still running very well. So I think that was a great decision. But unfortunately, I didn't fit to that culture myself, and I couldn't like put my passion to that kind of work. So that's why I resigned from the company, and then started to figure to to see what was the difference, and how could I have um, um, achieved both the growth of the company and also having the more, how could you say, heartful or treatful working styles and so on. And then I came to like Fred Laloux's book in English and like Holacracy and so on. And of course, a lot of works in Japan, but all those like English works was so fascinating for me. So I just went into all those, and it was so inspiring. But the moment I felt, there are some points that I felt that was different, and very kind of like a subtle feeling that there might be something different, and I couldn't explain what that was. And so having that kind of subtle feeling that um, and then I had a chance to speak to like European people, and I think it was in Greece, to explain how it is in Japan and what I feel. And having all those conversations with those Western culture people, I couldn't explain everything, that what I felt was different, what I felt, what this different was. So that was a very um, um, meaningful moment that I realized that I need to dig into something in the culture. That might be something deep inside. It might, the practices or what we do might be very similar, but something in deep inside might be different. So that was really my starting point to try to find out what is the difference between those subtle ones. So that's have been my 3 4 years to to become to understand what's the difference.
I remember when I first spoke to you, we were on a sort of group call, and you were sharing with us some of these distinctions that you've started to articulate. And I think you
Mhm.
referenced this book, Geography of Thought.
Mhm.
So, where are you in that journey? Could you share with us a couple of differences that you think might be interesting? Because, as you say, I think many of our listeners are kind of from a Western experience.
Yeah. Um, Maybe I'm not sure I could explain the difference between Western and Eastern, but mainly with the difference between Japan and mainly the North American or the
Yeah.
European. And European is a lot of there's a lot of difference there too. But what I feel in especially in Japan that I think it's referred a lot that as a culture we are have a very collective kind of um, mind um, compared to in the Western, it's more like an individual kind of culture. And and also to pretty much related to that, we are very in Japan, we are very good at reading between the lines, even though it's not descripted or explained. We could like feel what could be better for someone else or for the group or for the community. And that's the we could say that would be a strong point. But of course, sometimes that becomes to a weak point because we're not good at describing like job descriptions or defining exactly and so on. So that's something, some weak points we do have, and that might become a very, sometimes a very tragedy or something to become to end up in a very pretty much of a failure. And that kind of collective and individual kind of mindset, and also having the definition based movements or more like a relation or a reading between the lines kind of movements is a very basic difference we have. And moreover then, what, as I mentioned, that digging more into the culture, what is the difference that causes that kind of difference? It's more like that it seems that the basic perception we have of the world is pretty much is different within the culture. And in the Japanese or maybe the Eastern culture, we perceive more of the world as a dynamic kind of moving, moving, moving environment. And in the Western culture, it's more like the world could be perceived as a static, um, static world, and could you could like divide things and look into like like the tiniest atoms and so on to understand all the world. So the way you perceive the world, how dynamic it is or how static it is pretty much the very core difference we have. And that might cause to different ways of organizations when we put into practice.
Yeah, I wonder if it, do you think that makes it um, easier for companies in a Japanese culture to adapt to new ways of working?
It really depends on the situation because it's been for this like 50, 60, 70 years in Japan, we've been learning a lot from the Western culture, especially in the business world, like typically like the MBAs and so on. It's been we've learned a lot, and that's been a great help to bring us to where we are right now in this environment. So a lot is like, how do you say, westernized in the working environment. So I think that's not something we need to like blame, or like that wasn't wrong or something, but that was a very good period for us. But trying to figure out a new way that's suitable, that we don't have a best practice somewhere. We need to try to dig in by ourselves. What is our culture? What are the tendencies or the attributes we have in our culture? And figure out from that point what could be the difference, and then try to put into practice that is suitable for ourselves. And that process takes a lot of time, takes a lot of self-understandings and understanding of the organization or the culture and so on. So that brings me back to the subtle kind of a difference I felt when I went read Frederic Laloux's book or Holacracy or so on, that those methods or practices are so inspiring, what I could see. But the the foundation, if the foundation is different, we need to find the better ways by ourselves. And so that's something I've been passionate about, to find out what could be a better way in Japan, not just like installing or copying what we could see outside of Japan, but trying to like interpret or transform that into what is suitable for ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point, and it speaks to this tension that I have, which is that, you know, as I see it, a lot of the ills of the industrial era, came
Mm-hmm.
from the West. And as you say, the East uh, copied a lot of these ideas, integrated a lot of these ideas, and it would be reductive to say that that was all bad, as you say. Like, it has had some benefits, but now we can obviously see the impact that's having on the planet and the climate and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I feel sort of guilty about that. That as a European, as a Westerner, like, hey, we we sort of introduce these horrible ways of managing and working that are kind of soulless and mechanistic, and the East in many ways adopted them and reaped the benefits of that, but also the disadvantages and the hurt of that. And now the irony is that this new ways of working movement, the latest kind of phase of it, is so much driven by the West, it seems. Again, so we have, Frederick himself, and we have, Gary Hamel and people in the US and North America and Europe. And I find myself being approached by people in India or in China asking me to help them become teal or self-managed. And I feel really uncomfortable about that, because
Mm-hmm.
in some ways I think there are yeah, I think every organization has to find its own way to, find their version of some of these principles and practices. And I feel very uncomfortable about imposing anything. It's almost like reenacting colonialism if I'm not careful. Like, here, let me tell you the way to do it. And that's not at all what I want. But it's super interesting to me to discover, like, I'm working with this Buddhist meditation trainings company, and we're discovering, as I'm sort of talking about and sharing, my colleagues and I, some of the principles, uh, people are saying, like, oh, that's really, there's a parallel with that in Buddhism, because Buddha said this. And, then we start to find a language and a culture and a worldview that is theirs, and then start to think about how does that connect to creating more self-managing teams and all of that. So it's sort of this tension that I have. Um, and I think that, we should question and explore, because, yeah, to me also, I don't think the future of work should be another Western paradigm or dominant, paradigm of thought, right?
And I was talking with Kenshu, the source of the teal movement in Japan, this morning to discuss what I could share in this podcast today. And what we had, the same sense we had in common was that um, we, we we don't need we in Japan we don't need to feel that we are behind or something, or like we are not up to date about the self-organization or the new ways, but we have different criterias that what we see in our culture, or what we are trying to do in our culture, might not be seen from the same viewpoint. And what we have, or what we have been um, growing or implementing in our culture, is something that is different. And when in the previous time, when we were trying to install the Western ways, we tried to have the same way, same lens, same viewpoints to I won't say copy, but try to do the same thing. But now, trying to have the new way, it might be difficult for people from different cultures to see, because we do not have the exact same criteria. And that might be some points that I explained, that we are not good at defining or describing everything. We are good at like feeling, or like sensing. So that might be something we are not good at, to explain what we are doing into words and translate into English. But we, I'm pretty sure that we have a lot of knowledge and practices and wisdoms that have been embedded into from the practices we've got. And I think that's going to be our challenge, to try to describe that in words, to be able to deliver that. And I think that's going to be a very good starting point to learn from each other from different cultures. So, and to describe what we have in Japan, that has to be done by ourselves in Japan. So that's going to be our challenge, to be able to describe what would be the core difference, and how we could explain what we have here in Japan.
Yeah, I I don't know if this is a stupid question to ask given what you've just said, but is there do you have the beginnings of something that you can describe, or an example of something that's becoming clear to you in terms of, what it might look like in Japan, a teal organization, for example?
Yeah, it's gonna be a challenge to explain in English to begin with. But I have a concept that I have been working on for this 3 years, um, that we um, I call it Jinen management. Jinen is Jinen, and this is an old way of saying nature in English. Recently, we called it shizen, as nature. And the difference between these two words is that the shizen, the new word of saying nature, was started from, I think, the beginning of 19th century, when we translated, I think it was English or Dutch, either one, to nature. And when we translated that into the nature into shizen, the new word, it's pretty much um, had the same meaning, that as I mentioned in the difference between the culture, is that human is kind of like a separate from nature. Nature is something that we see, but when we use the word jinen, the old way of nature, we perceive that human beings are included or a part of the nature itself. So it's pretty much related to the religion of the animisms or so on, that the world is not separated. And more, we could say that in the world using the old term jinen, it's more like that we do not perceive the world as divided into like subjective and objective point of views, but it's kind of like a Buddhism wisdom that you perceive the world as it's the whole, but you don't perceive yourself as an individual. You are already included as the inside the whole as a whole on. So that's the I think that is a very key term that we could use between to describe the difference, how we perceive the world and how we perceive yourself and the organizations. And starting from that point, that we could see that the way of management or organizations could be different, perceiving that yourself as very naturally as a part of your maybe the organization, or more like the community, or the society, or maybe the world, that you do not divide yourself from the outer world. You're just really the part included as a part of the whole system. So starting from that point, that we could like describe the ways of management and the methods and the attitudes we would that would be suitable for those kind of organizations could be seen. And that's something I've been working on for this like 3 years, to be able to describe more in words. It's been a tough challenge, and it's still not there yet. But this difference, the very basic perception of the world, might be the starting point to put into practice what is different in the management or the organizations. And
Yeah,
also, if I
that's
could add once more, that I discussed it with Kensho, the source of teal, is that we do not need to think, is this teal or not? That's not an important question, because it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Or it's just that we want to find our kind of way. And it might happen to become some kind of a um, um, close to what Frederic Laloux says in his book, but that's not the point. We want to try to find out our own way that is suitable, and there might be a lot of ways, even in Japan. The way Jinen management is something that I and my community is doing, but that's not the only correct one. That's the same in Japan and also in the world. That's only one option we have. So I would like to be more um, able to explain more in words about this, but that's going to be a starting point. I would love to have feedbacks or questions, or like maybe like criticisms that's might not be good or something, but that conversation is gonna lead us as a whole to move on to more like a new organizations and new ways. So that's why we need to be able to express more in this in words.
yeah, that's interesting because I relate to that. I do a lot of trainings, and on the very first day we start with talking about uh, the kind of dominant paradigm. And I mean, we've done these trainings all over the world, and it seems to resonate with everyone. But I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear what you think. But in terms of leadership or management, we summarize it as like a parent-child mindset or way of being, that managers in particular relate. There's this dynamic of parent-child, and we're in whatever movement you're interested in, teal or self-management or agile or whatever. It seems like what's needed there is a more adult to adult dynamic way of relating, which is, and you use the word attitude, so I'm sort of interested in what the Jinen attitude might be, or what might be useful in terms of making it work.
I think I have two kind of different um, feelings or things that I like to talk. The first one is that it really resonates with what I feel in our culture to um, be a better part of a new way of working. It not requires, but it's suitable to have more adult attitude by yourself, and that would be one way. I do think it's really important, but on the other hand, I do feel that I don't want to make it or define it as a requirement that you need to be an adult to be a part of a new way of working. And when we use like the concept of Jinen management, it's more like a forest or a ecosystem that emerges. The forest doesn't have a commander or doesn't have an adult, but there are some parts that are very young, very has a lot of childhood, and that kind of role is still the part of the ecosystem. And we need those kind of parts too in the whole forest. So we don't want to like reject or make it as a requirement to be an adult. So that's I have a both way of seeing that.
Hmm. I'm wondering, like, what if there are, because it sounds like there are cultural understandings, or like there's even like language, like Jinen, there's like a shorthand that perhaps in Japanese culture people understand the essence of
Mhm.
that maybe lends itself to this more ecosystem paradigm way of working. I'm curious about if there are things in Japanese culture that you think make it difficult, because I think in European culture, for example, it's challenging that we tend to avoid conflict, for example, or it's difficult for
Oh,
us to be more um, whole human beings. We're very used to sort of only bringing parts of ourselves to work. There's all of these different cultural things that we almost have to unlearn. Or now I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm saying have to, because you so beautifully talked about it doesn't need to be a requirement, but it's sort of not so suitable, or it doesn't work so well if we're scared of those things, or we're driven more from ego. What are some of the challenges in a Japanese context, would you say?
um, there, I feel a lot of difficulties in languages. Not directly answering to your question, but in Japan we do not have a word that suits leadership or management because we use it as it is leadership and management because we do not have a good word for that, and that quite led us to when we try to install the Western way, we we didn't have the same concept as leadership. So we just tried to learn what it is said as leadership, and it's became so natural in Japan too to use the word leadership. But on the other hand, trying to as I've been working for this 3 years, trying to find a new way as like in the where the Jinen to like to manage the organization as if it is a forest or ecosystem. How could we describe someone who is taking the initiative? Or it's hard, it's not something that we I want to call leadership, but it of course includes a lot of aspects that what what we call or what we require in leaders. So it's really hard to describe that in our mother language. So it's really a challenge to understand what we really want and to have the concept or have a clear understanding about the concept is always a very challenge, happens a lot.
Hmm, that's interesting. I know my colleague, she was saying a similar thing in Russian, I think, that this word leadership, there's not a direct translation in Russian either. So it's really fascinating the assumptions that I make about concepts that don't exist in other languages or aren't understood in the same way. But it's interesting what you say about people who take initiative or start initiatives. And in your Jinen kind of uh, model, I guess you could call it, what are some qualities that are useful for someone to develop perhaps or
Mhm.
strengthen if they are wanting to thrive in that in this kind of environment?
It comes to kind of like the attitude the person has is to, I think the most important thing is to follow your own passion or enthusiasm, to not not answering to requirements or roles, but as you can see in the forest, everything is just all the trees or animals are just they're just trying to have their best to survive or to have their own children, and they they don't think about the forest or something, but everything starts from their individual passion. And as a system, as a conclusion, it has a good dynamic balance to emerge as a total. So it gets pretty tough when you try to react to roles or expectations from others, because that's not the way I would like to see in that kind of management style. I would like to see it as as much as possible that everyone starts from their own passion, maybe their own purpose, what they are moved by. And of course, there might be some conflicts or tensions that emerges if you have different passions or different directions to work on. But you the problems, as you it's mentioned in the as the tension emerges, when the conflict happens, problems are not seen as a kind of like a fact, but it's perceived from someone who has different tension, different passions. So having their own own direction or the passion would be the very starting point to be be for the person himself to be comfortable in these kind of environments too.
Hmm. That's an interesting way of thinking about conflict. I'm feeling a little bit uh, sheepish or embarrassed that I think in the West, I've spoken to a lot of Europeans, for example, about that I'm interested in exploring examples in other places in the world, and I mentioned that I had spoken to you in Japan, and I think people in the West perceive Japan as people have said to me like, oh, but it's very hierarchical there, isn't it? Like very family run businesses, a lot of those, and very polite and very formal. So surely it can't work there. So I think this is like a preconception that people outside of Japan have, perhaps, and I think I've been guilty of some version of that. Um, so I feel a little
Yeah,
bit embarrassed.
yeah, but it's of course it's true in some aspects that, and I can't deny everything about the what they've said, but something I might add to what you've mentioned is like the families. It's a strong tradition to have the families in Japan. It's getting weak, of course, than before, but the concept of family is very important in Japan, and it's it's hard to explain in English, but as I mentioned that when we perceive ourselves not divided into subjective and objective viewpoints, being a member of a family and being yourself is not a conflict. It's just the same circle on different sizes. So you're not being pressured to follow the family's order or something, but it's very natural for yourself to like express your own passion, but also feel that what would be better for the whole family. It's not a conflict because we really sense that as the same thing. And maybe it's from a different perspective. Like, for example, like I think it was in the World Cup or something, or rugby's or something, that when the Japanese audience of the stadium,
When they
after
tidied up
the,
after themselves.
yeah, exactly. So no one punishes that, or no one gets angry if you don't do that. But it's so natural for ourselves to just clean up what we messed up, and that's like sensing what could be better for the whole community. And no one just orders that, but that's very natural. That's pretty much the same when we sense what could be better for the family or maybe for the community. And of course, sometimes it might be like pressuring or um, pushing people to do what they won't like to do. Of course, that happens. So I can't. I do understand that you, you could sense that as a hierarchical something, or but it's not always that way when you perceive yourself as a part of the whole community. So it has both aspects too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, that example you share, because it's so often the example I use when I'm talking to people about self-organizing is that, if you say we're all responsible for taking out the trash, don't be surprised when the trash doesn't get taken out, because that so often happens. And maybe that just doesn't happen in Japanese companies then. Maybe it's not such
Well,
a.
of course it happens. It's not always so,
Mm,
but we have the common experience that or the sense that to feel very natural to contribute to the community, or what could be better at that moment, at that place.
mm. Um, yeah, I feel like there's so many more things I would like to ask. Maybe we have to have a follow-up conversation when you've kind of refined further this idea that you're working on. But I guess a question I have now is about what advice you would give listeners, because you've shared some beautiful insights, I think, into a different way of approaching exploring new ways of working. You've talked about, starting with understanding what is your like view of the world, how do you see the world, and sort of getting a shared understanding of that. And then you've also talked about starting with your passion and what moves you and what your energy is sort of moving you towards. So, what advice would you give listeners about how to find their own way as an organization, as a community, to find their version of a teal organization or a self-organization or whatever it is that they want to aspire to?
I don't have any right answers for that, or just based on my journey for this 3 or 4 years, that it was a very kind of like an unlearning process of what we've been learning from the Western culture and what we have. And it happened to be the Japanese culture or the tradition or the ancient wisdom we have in Japan to when I um, get in touch with those kind of wisdom, then I feel I can sense that what I do not have right now in my organization or in the typical management right now. So it was a very good lens to see the reality I'm facing right now. And the subtle feeling I felt was kind of like the first clue I had to start feeling what is different and what is not like connected to the deep wisdom I or we have. So trying to figure out from your own culture or the what you the originated wisdom or culture or those kind, I think there must be something that gives you a kind of like a question mark or a, like what is this, or doesn't be feel comfortable or something like that. So I think that's going to be a really good starting point to figure out what could be unlearned throughout the reality you're facing right now.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting because I think I talk about unlearning all the time with companies that I'm working with in the West as well. So I think we're unlearning our own stupid ideas. Well, they're not stupid. They had some benefits, but things that we've introduced that have taken us away from, I think, the essence of what it means to be human and what it means to be be with and work with other human beings. Is there anything else that you haven't shared yet that you would really like listeners to hear?
It's more like um, not maybe an invitation or a request that I would, for me personally, I would love to have like more conversations like this to of course I would love to share what I could say from my point of view in my culture, but what we did today, like that, what we feel different is the point we could start learning from each other. So I think having this kind of conversation more would be very supportive and useful for both of us. So I'd love to have more experiences or any chances to explore more differences with other cultures. So any opportunities for those would be very glad and thankful for me too.